This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi. We're the media partners for ORCA, that's the Organization for Research on China and Asia's Global Conference on New Sinology. And our experts today, our analysts today, are Professor Johan Lagerkvist from the Stockholm University and Dr. Li Nan, who is from the National University of Singapore. Professor and Doctor, thank you so much for giving us time. It's a real pleasure to have you one-on-one after we listen to you at the conference. Prof, if I can start with you straight away and take off from your recently released book, Organized Loyalty. How in control can we judge Xi Jinping to be, given the fact that there are very few facts that we really know what's happening inside China?
It's a very good question. It's hard to know just from looking at open data. It's also hard to go to China to do field studies these days. So we have to glean insights from what we get from sources on the internet or from the scholars that can actually go to China. And despite centralization over the past decade and personalization of Chinese politics under Xi, it seems to be that he has also created quite a lot of enemies in the party, perhaps even in the military, and also a lot of indifference among ordinary people in society. But it's hard also for those actors in society or in the Chinese political system to ventilate frustration, because it's also fraught with risk to be seen as an opponent to Xi Jinping's policies. So it's hard to gauge, but things are probably simmering under the surface.
Simmering under the surface, Dr. Li. Just taking up from what the professor was saying here, explain to us what actually the professor says simmering. Some analysts say there's turmoil in China. When you look at what's happening in the military, the defense ministers disappeared. I mean, your rocket forces are being reorganized. People are supposedly committing suicide. Explain to us, in your reading, what is the situation vis-a-vis the civil military platforms?
That's a very good question. But I personally think he is still in control. He's still in control. Even though his control is kind of weakened. Weakened in the sense, first of all, the military was given a lot of autonomy. It also has a lot of money to spend because of defense modernization. And finally, they have the monopoly of expertise. They are very good with technical expertise. These are leverages the military had. But it's ironically, they were also involved in corruption. So in that sense, I would say corruption is routinized. Counter-corruption is also routinized in the sense that she was weakened. His power was weakened to a certain extent, but not to the extent that somebody wanted to get together a overthrow him. Simply because these divisions, investigations are based on specialized services. People cannot get together, to overthrow Xi Jinping, even though they work in the PLA. They are divided. Their interests are different. Plus, in a sense, I would say they are driven not by political motivations. There are rumors that, for instance, the New York Times had an article speculating that some of these officers work with the discontent of their subordinates, which may not be true. These are corrupt officers. They do this to enrich themselves, to enrich their relatives and friends. They are not motivated by politics. I personally don't think so. So in that sense, it's probably pretty easy. It's not easy, but it's not that difficult for Xi Jinping to deal with these sort of issues.
Interesting point that you make. Prof, again, we heard you talk about the domestic drivers in China's foreign policy. How much does domestic issues relating to what China has to do with Taiwan govern what she will do in terms of a timeline, or does he make the issues, both domestic and foreign policy, decide what they are?
Well, he is the final arbiter in the Chinese political system when it comes to not just domestic policy making, but also foreign policy making. And Taiwan is really the crucial territory that Xi Jinping needs to retrieve to the People's Republic in order to achieve what he says is going to be lasting greatness for China and the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So it's really, really important to get it back. And also he has been propelled to a certain extent by the popular nationalists that he himself and the party have stoked for decades, not even before he took power in 2012. So he has, by his more assertive foreign policy vis-a-vis India, vis-a-vis the United States, also sort of painted himself into a corner where he has to do something to be seen as not just a rhetorically, a strong man, but also in practice, getting Taiwan back. So he is in a hurry, I think, to achieve unification with Taiwan. When and how and where that will happen, that will depend also on what we just discussed, domestic discontent with Xi's policies and turmoil inside China. It's always useful for any political leader in any system to divert attention or to get public opinion looking in another direction. So therefore, creating or provoking a Taiwan incident in the Strait, it could happen. We cannot say it's not going to happen. So, and he is old. He is in his 70s, and his tenure could be long for life. But we don't know how long he will live. Yeah. So he may be in a hurry to get Taiwan back in some way or another.
And I note you say unification, like the Taiwanese say it's not reunification because, that's... Dr. Lee, you brought up the issue of corruption, and especially in the military, where you look at very closely in China. In your view, if you speak to us on corruption, how much of it is it an actual problem, and how much of it is an excuse to necessarily if Xi Jinping needs to purge people?
It is a very entrenched, extensive problem, corruption, going back to the time that Deng decided to cut defense budget to tell the POA to go into business back in the 1980s. So it was very entrenched, extensive, to the point, investigation takes very long. She has been in power for 3 terms, more than a decade at this point. Investigation is still going on. So it is a very entrenched problem. Is it an excuse? Okay. For instance, an alternative explanation is power struggle. Is consolidation of Xi Jinping's power. But that interpretation is flawed in the sense that, he appointed all the new officers. After a few months, he removed them. So that looks bad on him. He doesn't build up the political capital on the part of Xi Jinping. He reduces political capital. He could be perceived as being incompetent, making poor judgment about using people to take these positions. So he doesn't gain, he loses political capital. So I don't think political explanation, power struggle, explain this phenomena very well. So I think it's genuine corruption. He is doing counter-corruption. I mean, sure, I mean, he could gain out of that by showing that he's impartial, he continues this effort. So in that sense, he doesn't lose everything.
I think it was you, Professor, in the conference, I may be mistaken, when you were talking about accountability and how, the bureaucrats or anybody in control was always scared of accountability coming back to them, to bite them. But in this case, as Dr. Lee is pointing out, accountability, if Xi doesn't, those are different set of rules.
Yes, he has moved to a position which is sort of above and beyond accountability and responsibility. But also, it is hard to tell to what extent senior leaders inside the Communist Party, the elders, Zheng Qinghong and others that work close to former President and General Secretary Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, for that matter, if they see that what I call organized loyalty, the prescriptions for party cadres, state officials, generals, and even academics at universities and in wider society, the prescriptions for correct behavior and a correct way of expressing themselves is stifling Chinese society and also the dynamism of the Chinese economy. So there are rumors also that he has been, criticized to some extent by those that are in a position, also in positions above and beyond accountability, outside the system, so to speak. So he has moved to a position where he's to a significant degree unassailable, but there are still those that can sting and reprieve him from the sidelines, retired senior cadres. So that's also I think, a testimony and witness of how his legitimacy is also tarnished by, as what Dr. Lee said about his ability to choose and appoint his key persons in the establishment. If that fails, it reflects badly on him. So we will have to watch out for how that deterioration of his image will have further consequences for his rule.
Dr. Lee, I know this is a very broad question, but if you want to give your thoughts on how does the world deter or constrain China when it's behaving the way it does?
It has already been deterred. When we talk about Taiwan, China is making adjustments. Simply because, the original plan by the quick decisive war, we need to quickly reduce collateral damage to the point they could take a hold on Taiwan. But, what they have learned from Ukraine, the war may end up being protracted. A lot of attrition drags on for years, a quagmire. And China, the POA doesn't want to get into a quagmire like the Ukrainian and the Russians did. So in a sense, they're also concerned about the domestic ramifications of that sort of if China decided to attack Taiwan. For instance, Wagner Group organized a coup. That's something China was very much concerned about. And also, U.S. Secretary of Defense Austin talks about employing Ukraine to weaken Russia. And the Chinese leaders are very sensitive to these sort of comments. If you want to weaken Russia, Ukrainian sovereignty is not the issue. U.S. doesn't help the Ukrainians to restore its national sovereignty. It uses Ukrainians to weaken Russia. So what if Americans want to use Taiwan to weaken China? That's their conclusion. So that's why I wouldn't go as far as suggesting they're going to attack Taiwan. They have to think about the consequences. They have to worry about losing out of control, like a coup. If the war drags on, if it continues as a protracted war of attrition, then the POA might be, might not be in control. Particularly, we talk about diversion of war, right? But it's a very risky business. You don't do diversion of war simply because you have no control over the outcome of the war. So those are some of the concerns the Chinese leaders, including Xi Jinping himself, are thinking about at this point. And I don't think they're going to make a quick decision about attacking Taiwan. First, we talked about the rise of China, Taiwan is a necessary condition to fulfill that. But now it becomes, Taiwan might be an impediment to the rise of China. What if you fight a war and the U.S. used the war as a proxy to weaken China, to the point China, the regime survival might be in question. So those are some of the concerns the leadership are very worried about. So those are some of the issues we all have to worry about as well.
Again, Professor Lagerkvist, if you want to give your thoughts on deterrence, how it's working with China. I mean, like I'm saying, it's a very broad thing, constraining China. Where do you think we are at this moment, and how do we continue on that trajectory?
That is not really my field of expertise.
Understood.
But I do think that you have to weigh your words very carefully when you're engaging with Chinese leaders, diplomats, in order to, drive home the message that there are certain policies and principles of the rules-based world order, the liberal world order, that benefits also China, and therefore it would be to the detriment of Chinese interests if they would not see that this world order is actually something that has benefited China's rise, and it will continue to benefit China in the future. So I think you can, of course, work in terms of military deterrence through economic coercion, and possibly, if need be, if there's a conflict or even a kinetic war, not just a propaganda war, you have to work through sanctions, even though you can always debate if that's something that is yielding results. But there are a whole arsenal of tools that you can you can apply to deter Chinese behavior if it becomes a behavior that is of grave concern to those states that try to uphold the world order, India, US, and its allies.
So let me ask you something that's more up your street, since you talk about domestic drivers of foreign policy in China. For example, what happened with India on the border in Ladakh. The Chinese system anyway is opaque, and especially when it comes to, say, releasing figures of casualties, etc., won't be done. In that kind of scenario, how do you see China working on hiding what's happening because there would be a consequence domestically? Do you see a consequence domestically from setback?
Yes, of course. It's always incredibly important for the leaders of China to portray its relations with the outside world in such a way that benefits China's leaders and the Chinese Communist Party as a competent ruler of China and a competent foreign policy maker. So any news that trickles into China's heavily censored media system and online media is always sort of designed to diminish those facts, those news that point to failures or mistakes. In case of the Chinese military encroachments, in border disputes with Bhutan, with India, and with other neighbors in the South China Sea, definitely that is the case also. So they're trying to choke the information, and because otherwise we could see a surge in popular nationalism pointing to the failures of the supreme leader and the Chinese military not doing what they're saying they will do.
Luckily, again, the same point now in terms of if they are body bags, Chinese, you were talking about Taiwan becoming, say, in Ukraine, a dragged out war, if one of the potential possibilities. Can the Chinese society accept Chinese body bags coming back, soldiers coming back dead? Or how do they deal with that?
The leadership, they understand, they have to think about the ramifications of that sort of war. That's why I say China is deterred by the U.S. decision to stockpile, materials in Taiwan, because they were really following this scenario. They try to, store munitions into households. They want to fight a people's war against China, even though China invented the people's war. So those are some of the concerns China now has. They worry about collateral damage, the damage to the territory of civilians. The whole cities would blow up, because Taiwan is a narrow island. It doesn't have depth of defense. It's very difficult to defend. So eventually they have to fight urban warfare, that sort of thing. So that's why I think the U.S. preparation now, intensified preparation, deters China. So I don't think that they will make a decision to attack Taiwan for quite a while. I think they are playing the long game, I don't think there will be an imminent decision to attack Taiwan. Personally, I don't think so.
And do you see also...
and also about the rise of popular nationalism, China has always been in tight control. Populist nationalism never drives foreign policy. It's not a democracy. For instance, look at, they build those airfields in South China Sea. They cover up. Nobody knows until they build up they complete building up the airfields. Then they publicize it. So people, they don't know that China is building up in the South China Sea until after a couple of years they build up and then they show the results. So it was not driven, the policy was not driven by populist nationalism.
How do you see the world having moved away from years and sometimes decades of not only appeasement of China, but the West looked at a lot now in hindsight as having fueled this rise of China to having changed tack? Do you see that?
I'm sorry.
Appeasement versus constrainment. Do you think there's a general policy change in dealing with China over time?
Constrainment, in a sense, it's a make that point. I mean, except, on the part of China, I think it's still the West is still engaging in containing China, right? I mean, that's their perception. I mean, that's why China, Chinese behavior is being perceived as being aggressive.
But there was a time, I think in the conference, I'm not sure who it was, who said, including India's policy, which was don't rock the boat. Somebody used that phrase. I'm talking about that and appeasement and even the West fueling what is the rise of China. And now, do you see a change?
China has a different interpretation. Because from their perspective, they didn't really deploy that many troops along the border. There are only 4 combat brigades as opposed to Indian much higher superiority. So they are on the defensive. They are on the defense, even though it's forward deployment-based active defense. It's active, but it's defensive. So that's their strategy. 4 combat brigade facing India, 200,000 soldiers along the borders. But they leverage the terrain. They are higher and so forth. Basically Chinese strategy is forward deploy, but it's also defense for the purpose of defense. If you want to fight a war of offense, you need to have a superiority in terms of 3 or 4 times the Indian side. But look at the Chinese deployment. It's sure you can talk about reinforcement here, extending all the way to Sichuan, Chengdu, or Xinjiang. But, those the frontline border, they have a few lightly armed regiments, border defense regiments, supported by 4 combat brigades. So in a sense, you can tell, talking to any specialist, they would say Chinese position is for defense, it's not for offense. You need much more troops in order to have an offense against India. That's my personal interpretation. And I consult many military specialists in the U.S. They generally agree with me.
Dr. Lee, again, thank you so much for sharing your time and, Professor, your time, your expertise, and your experience with us. Thank you so much, sir. Thanks again, Professor.
Thanks for having
Real
me.
pleasure. And for our viewers, you can send us feedback on this interview, give us any topics or guests or analysts that you would like to have on our show as well. You can follow all our social media handles to get the latest that we put up on our website, articles or interviews like this on our YouTube channel. And there's also a QR code that is on your screen if you would like to help us financially. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.